and accountability for the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women. I bring you greetings today from our General Secretary, Dawn Wiggins here, and we're so glad that you've all decided to spend a little time with us. We're extremely pleased to have the Reverend Diane Kenaston, who has led the charge of organizing I'll say the whole church, the United Methodist Church, in lifting up the importance of parental leave policies so that we might have some equity amongst our annual conferences. And so we are going to hear from some extraordinary panelists today from across our connection: Andrea Byer-Thomas, Claire Wu, Jae Song, Katie Nix, Crystal Jacobson, and Nick J. Jacobson. So for our time together this morning, I'd ask that you please mute yourselves because we will be highlighting our panelists. We don't want you to pop up as the panelists when we're trying to highlight the speaker for the moment. So let's take a moment to center ourselves, please. Creator, Earth, Mother, we thank you for our lives and this beautiful day. Thank you for the bright sun and the rain we received last night. Thank you for this circle of friends and the opportunity to be together. We want to thank you especially at this time for the giveaways of their lives, made by the chickens, the beets, carrots, grains, and lettuce. We thank them for giving of their lives so we may continue our lives through this great blessing. Please help us honor them through how we live our lives. Amen. This prayer was written by Mary Fallahay from the Bear Tribe Medicine Society. And I lifted this particular centering moment because I'm mindful that today is Thursday, when we typically wear Black, in remembering that we will continue to fight until all women are free from violence of all kinds across the world. And when we think about our siblings who are Native people, their statistics for missing girls in particular are really off the charts as it relates to the rest of society. 84.3% have experienced violence. Girls and women have experienced violence. That's 4 out of 5. And 55.5% have been physically abused by their intimate partners. So there is always much work to do. Keep our whole world. As we say, God's got the whole world in his hands. Keep the whole world, especially women and girls, in your prayers as you move throughout this day, but all of your days. And all this we ask in Jesus' name, amen. So I'm pleased to invite Diane to be the highlight now.
Amen. Thank you, Denise, so much for that welcome and for the invitation for this panel to share their wisdom with you. Our panel discussion does feature the wisdom from 5 out of the 6 annual conferences that brought forward expanded parental leave legislation this year. We celebrate that Florida, Missouri, New York, Upper New York, and Peninsula Delaware all passed expanded parental leave in 2024. 4 of those did that on their annual conference floor, and 1 of those, Florida, passed that legislation through their cabinet and didn't need to take it because the cabinet approved the policy. Today, we're also going to learn from the experience of the Indiana Annual Conference, which also brought legislation to the conference floor, although it was referred, and they plan to refine and bring it back in 2025. And we can learn just as much from the struggles that we have as our successes. So I'm really excited to hear from all 5 of those annual conferences. I'm going to introduce our expert panelists and then guide us through several questions. Following the official questions, we will open the floor up for a Q&A. So please be thinking now about the questions that you have. The goal today is to learn from their experiences so that we can apply their wisdom in our own contexts. If you are from a conference that has already passed this legislation, I believe what it will be shared today will be helpful in passing any legislation in any annual conference going forward. Our first panelist is the Reverend Ji-Hae Song. She is serving as Associate Director of Missional Excellence at the Upper New York Annual Conference, in which she develops resources and provides advocacy for cross-racial and cross-cultural pastors. She's also serving as the United Methodist Chaplain at Hendricks Chapel of Syracuse University. Thank you, Ji-Hae. Our next panelist is Pastor Claire Wu. Claire is serving as the pastor at Farmingdale United Methodist Church in Long Island, New York, in the New York Annual Conference. And she is passionate about empowering women to grow, connect, and create an uplifting space in Christ. Our third panelist is the Reverend Dr. Andrea Bayer-Thomas. She is a native of the Twin Island state of Antigua and Barbuda, currently serving as the chair of COSRO in Florida. Some of her favorite activities include reading, writing, gardening, dancing, soap making, and crafting. Our next panelist will be the Reverend Dr. Katie Nix. She is the lead pastor at Grace United Methodist Church in St. Louis, and she was a member of the Missouri Annual Conference Values Team. In Missouri, the Values Team is the COSRO equivalent. And our final panelist is stepping in at the last moment. The Reverend Mary Dicken was originally scheduled to speak on behalf of Indiana, and she had a delayed flight coming back to the US from Ghana. So she's currently in the air and lined up another person from Indiana to step in. The Reverend Crystal Jacobson was the Indiana COSRO director from 2020 to 2024. She had her second child in her second year of serving a United Methodist Church in 2009. And she is here with her husband, Nick, who has also experienced taking parental leave as a clergyman. So we're going to ask each panelist a starter question, which is just to tell us briefly about the process in your annual conference. And I've invited them to keep that to 2 minutes so we can dig into more questions later. Ji-Hae, would you go first?
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Ji-Hae, as Diane introduced, and I'm here at Upper New York. So I was invited to this process in Upper New York in January of this year. So conversation has been already going on in the team, and then they were refining the language of the model legislation that Diane has provided to the context of Upper New York. And we were working on how to adapt that into our context. And one of the benefits that we had as a New York State is that the New York State has a paid family leave, which is a little more than the FEMA, the other things, sorry, not FEMA, but anyway, they have a paid family leave that covers us up to 12 weeks. And so we were able to secure some funds because always the financial ramification is always the hot potato for every annual conference. So we were able to make our case a little easier than other states. But when we wanted to extend it to the 13th week, we were a little bit in conundrum, like where to find the fund for the 13th week. And so our team members were in conversation, and the one in our team is here also as a listening here. She actually reached out to the bishop to discuss if that's not out of order, because we're so afraid that if it's out of order and it's not even discussed at your conference, and then we want this to make happen. So we had a confirmation from the bishop that this is in order, but we couldn't find the fund for the 13th week from the paid family leave, so that we have to kind of put it up in the air where to find the 13th week. But what we wanted is, even though there's no funding for the 13th week, we still want that to be in our policy, that the parents can have the 13th week of the leave if they so choose. And the other thing is that we also wanted to include not only the clergy, but also lay employees that are they're hired by the annual conference or the annual conference sponsored ministries. We unfortunately could not do for the all lay employees for the local churches because there are so many things to consider for that. But at least we want to expand it to the lay employees of the annual conference and the annual conference sponsored ministries. So that's an expansion that we made at Upper New York. Is there anything else I should?
That's great. We will come back to you in a moment.
Thank you.
And as Jihye just shared, I remembered I didn't lay out the goals for the expanded parental leave legislation. One of the goals is that the quarter of the year guaranteed in the Book of Discipline is specifically defined as 13 weeks, not just 12 weeks. So we have various annual conferences and local churches that interpret a quarter of a year as 12 weeks. But if you divide 52 by 4, it is 13. So that is one of the goals. This is more than what FMLA, the Family and Medical Leave Act, allows for or guarantees. And so I appreciate Jihye sharing how that happens in Upper New York. If you'd like to learn.
Can I interrupt? Sorry, I just got a message from my team that I was incorrect. All the lay employees of local churches are included in our policy. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And I'm putting into the chat the coffee chat from February in which we get into what all of these goals are. So today we're really going to look into how to pass the legislation in your annual conference. But if you want to learn more about the policy itself and the goals of it, you can look at this sort of coffee chat from February. So our next panelist will be Pastor Claire Wu from New York.
Hello, everyone. I'm Claire from New York Annual Conference. Well, first of all, the New York Annual Conference was actually very lucky that Reverend Dr. Denise Sears was our leader. But first of all, she met with a bishop and the director of a connection ministry and shared its importance. And she received their affirmation of support. Then we called the annual conference casserole and came together to have this particular conversation around this policy legislation. And the day we gather the meeting, not only women from across the connection showed up, but also we had a couple of men attend our meeting as well to show their interest very much. So while our meeting, we had a very honest conversation about our experience and some pastors' experience of paternity leave and how hard it was. And we also shared that our bishop also supported the parental leave policy because he was the first one to take parental leave in his annual conference tens of years ago. And I believe it was a West Virginia conference where he's from. As a male, he took at that time when he had children, and he knew how it was so important. So we just shared the honest conversation. But one concern, actually the major concern grew up because we realized that we did not have any standardized way of offering parental leave. So we all agreed have a standardized policy to apply to the pastors. So in this way, it will be very helpful so that more people will be educated, and it is beneficial for the family, which is also the beneficial for the church. So with this, we brought it up to the annual conference legislation session, and by God's help, we didn't have a lot of pushback, and it passed it 100%. So I just want to share with you the process, how we did it at New York Annual Conference.
Thank you so much, Pastor Claire. And I think that example of getting a bishop on board early in the process is one that other conferences can emulate. And we hope that everyone can pass unanimously like you did in New York. All right, let's move to Reverend Dr. Andrea Beyer-Thomas.
Hello, great day to everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and serving alongside you. So here in the Florida Annual Conference, our parental leave policy is in place, And this policy was brought to the cabinet. Actually, it did not come through the conference for discussion, for debates, or any of that. We had a member of the cabinet who was working on the original expansion, which really turned out to be for our benefit. Dr. Debbie Keller Allen, who is the director of the Center of Clergy Excellence. And she has been part of the initial work. So she brought this before the cabinet adopted it, and so we have the policy that is in place. And this policy really is very beneficial both to parents and to the local churches that the clergy people serve. It is also extended to lay people who are serving as clergy. I am not sure to what extent lay employees themselves are included in the expanded version of parental leave, but they do receive parental leave. And our statement says that we do this and provide payment for this a quarter of the year.
Thank you so much. And I think this example from Florida of you don't have to go to the whole annual conference floor if you have a cabinet that is responsible for the current parental leave policy, and they can just upgrade the policy internally. So thank you so much for sharing that. All right. Reverend Dr. Katie Nix.
Well, you're going to notice that I'm going to sound a little different because I'm from Missouri. And so we had to pass our policy here in a slightly more conservative setting where we don't have mandatory parental leave at the state level or things like that. So how our process worked is I'm a member of the values team on the conference, which is kind of the extension of this group and others. And it was one of those that we kind of took the approach of let's ask for forgiveness instead of permission. So we had the parental leave all written up, and it was important for us in Missouri to also include foster parents, adoptive parents, expanding the idea of who would need this leave. And we took it to the values team and said, we think this is really important and we want you to vote yes. And they said, of course, this sounds great. And that was the easy part, because then you had to find the funding for it. So then I had to go to what is our clergy support team. That's a different team. And I found my champion on that group beforehand. So I connected with another female pastor and said, this is really important. I need you to be the bulldog to make sure this gets through. And so she brought it up. We had some meetings with our director of finance. The big question with the funding, of course, is we knew that churches would be able to continue to pay for the salary. The funding we were looking for is who's going to cover pulpit supply, pastoral care, all of these things while they are away. And so the Missouri Annual Conference has an emergency fund that we have used sometimes to help pastors who have medical emergencies. But we had to wrestle a little bit because there's only so many pennies in the bank. So part of it was also using language to talk about the priority and importance of supporting our pastors who are having children as well, and knowing that wrestling with the reality, meaning there may be some less funds available, perhaps for some of our retired pastors who might have financial emergencies. But because we could show statistics that, this is not talking millions and millions of dollars, we're talking a few parental leaves per year. They kind of absorbed it into the clergy support, and it actually sparked a bigger conversation about better defining how does vacation leave, taking time away for continuing education. Like it became a catalyst to go, let's just talk about well-being in general. And this was kind of the anchor moving forward. So really, once we knew all of the players who needed to say yes would say yes, when we brought it to the floor, that was an easy, everyone voted and approved, because you should always go into a vote knowing what the answer is going to be ahead of time. And so we passed it with a unanimous, and everyone was very excited. And I thought, I really didn't do much of the work because I took West Ohio's conference and I replaced the word West Ohio with Missouri. And then I found other people to help push it through. And then I just presented it and it passed. And so big win for Missouri on that.
Thank you, Katie. And I think that example of all of the advanced work is one that is able to be applied across conference settings, because you want to make sure that people who control the funding have had a chance to get all of their concerns met in advance. Okay. So we're now going to move to the Indiana Annual Conference with the Reverends Crystal and Nick Jacobson.
Hi there. So as was shared earlier, I was not the original presenter, so she's given me some notes. So I'm just going to read them, and they might be part of what I'm supposed to be saving for later. So my apologies about that. Indiana was the only annual conference with this legislation presented in 2024 that did not pass it. Things to note. Our conference moved to refer every resolution that was properly submitted this year. One was even ruled out of order. Finances came up as a concern. The CFA did not properly review and consider the impact of this resolution. When the chair was questioned about financial implications, he said, "I don't know. It could be fine or it could bust the budget." Note that the legislation was properly submitted 90 days prior so that financial implications could be considered. Later, a lay delegate urged the body to do no harm to the budget. In a semi-private conversation afterwards, the CFA chair told me, this is Mary speaking, that Mary and Julia should have emailed him the proposal if we wanted it considered. I countered that we followed stated procedure. He insisted that we should have contacted him personally. I pushed back again that these clergy persons could not have known to do that. At that point, he was wagging his finger at me and insisting he's easily accessible and we should have known that. I finally said that while I know him, I'm not sure how he expects younger, newer clergy to know to get a hold of him. If he wants that as a procedure, he should ask the conference to revise the resolution submission form and add a step to to email him at the printed address. Otherwise, he was perpetuating a good old boys network. It was a very heated conversation. Ultimately, a female superintendent moved to refer the legislation. She simultaneously confused the body by reassuring everyone that the Book of Discipline already has protections for family leave. This matches the patterns of other resolutions we dealt with. On one focused on cultural competency, a superintendent also moved to refer that one. It is worth noting that in both cases, general support for the proposals were voiced, but concern expressed about details. The superintendents did not, however, propose any amendments, which would have been proper and true to the democratic process. I believe the failure to pass the legislation in Indiana is rooted in our undemocratic conference culture. We are a top-down corporate-style conference. Since this legislation and the others that were referred did not come from conference leadership, but rather grassroots in origin, they were quickly killed through cabinet-initiated referrals. Final note, Mary was sitting near older clergy women in tears as all this unfolded. They had deeply personal and painful experiences related to the proposal and were dismissed by how our conference responded. So that's a little bit about Indiana.
Thank you, Crystal. And thank you for sharing Mary's words and for your work in shepherding this legislation through. We know that there are big structural issues that can come up through all of this. One of our panelists, the Reverend G. Hay, is needing to leave in about 7 minutes. So we are going to direct the next series of questions towards her. And if you have any particular questions for the Reverend G. Hay song, please put those into the chat so we can make sure she has a chance to address them. So G. Hay, can you get into more what worked well and what didn't in Upper New York?
Absolutely. So like New York conference, having Bishop on our side was a win. And so I didn't do it. One of my team members did. She reached out to the bishop and see if this is okay to go. And so when this is actually on the floor, he's already aware of what's going on, and he's on our side. Maybe the challenge that I felt had is that we really didn't have time to discuss it on the floor because all the legislation were pushed back to the last minute. And so we really didn't have an opportunity and was just passed with one amendment. But I guess the challenge happens later after the annual conference because people were okay at the conference, but later they approached me and showed their concerns. And it's mostly about like, what if all the new parents take that 13 weeks? What's going to happen to the church? Like, is it okay? And I regret that we didn't have a moment to discuss it, because if we were all able to do that, I was going to make a case that this is not just for the person who had just had a baby. It's more about their wellness and how does it affect to the wellness and the well-being of the church. When you don't think about the wellness and the well-being of their pastor and employees, then they cannot bring it back, the healthy energy back to their ministry. And people are like, what's going to happen when they are gone for more than 3 months? What about the discontinuity? And like, they're so afraid of that. And I want to say, actually, that's more healthier than having sleep deprived, poor new mom coming back and have no time to rest and take care of herself, rather that they are having this bond with a new baby, have a family all settled and come back. So I really want to emphasize this is for the wellness of the employee and the pastors. And my personal experience that when I had my child, I was only given 8 weeks, not 12 even, and that was enough time. So it's for the wellness of the clergy and the employee, for the wellness of the churches.
Thank you so much. If you want to see the most adorable picture of Jihei's son at her ordination, I'm going to put the link to that in the chat. But Jihei, what advice do you have for other annual conferences?
So I want other annual conferences to note that we no longer call it maternity leave, but we call it parental leave. And that's in my opinion, that's a very important step to include not only a birthing parent, but also the other partner. And also this policy includes the parent by birth, adoption, and foster. And so this is really like an issue of social justice, in my opinion. And I want other annual conferences to see how important this issue is.
Thank you. And we do have a specific question from the chat, which is, where did Upper New York find the funding for this legislation and policy?
Okay, so money is my weak spot, so my team members can help me. For one thing, in New York State, there is a paid family leave policy, which guarantees up to 2/3 of their salary when somebody's in parental leave, up to 12 weeks. So up to 2/3 of their salary, well, there's a maximum because they don't guarantee for those who make too much money, but there is, for clergy, it will be probably covered for 2/3 of their salary from the insurance. And then the other a third will be covered by churches.
Thank you. And we will have a very specific workshop in November, and people from the Upper New York Annual Conference, including Ian Uriola, will be leading this with discussions about how to find funding, whether your conference has states that have FMLA expanded in their state or not. So again, that is going to be on Wednesday, November 13th at this same time. And we'll speak more about that at the end of the session. Are there any other questions specific for Jihei? All right, seeing that, thank you so much for sharing with us today and for your work in Upper New York Annual Conference. Again, that article that I linked has some of her words to the conference floor, and it's just very inspiring. So thank you. All right. So we're now going to move through some of these questions with our other panelists. Is Pastor Claire Wu still here? She's no longer pinned. So Crystal, if you could pin Pastor Claire. All right. Oh, there you go. All right, wonderful. Claire, let's start with you. What worked well in the New York Annual Conference and what didn't? What challenges did you face?
Well, through our the gathering together, our sharing the stories and the experience of how it was hard, how it was joyful, and those kind of concern, it really helped us. And especially, our leaders like Bishop's story or the other our leaders, the cabinet's story is really very effective to move our hearts, especially to the laity and congregation and the pastors, very well. And also the template, the policy that Reverend Diane shared with us, it worked very well as our base to where to start and how to begin. And then just getting the everyone get one same understanding, same passion. It's really important to move. And once we gather or we all agree with that, it was very fast move. We started I remember that I was joined this chat the last year about like a September and October, but our annual conference was June this year. But within the year, with all the motions and create the policy and it really moved really fast. So my recommendation is that getting the people's heart and the passion together. That's a first thing. And I recall that New York Annual Conference didn't have any pushback, but of course, it's a new things. Of course, it has challenges to, especially to understand what does that mean and how we're gonna apply for our church, how we're gonna apply to pastors and what does that mean? What is the definition of each word? But that on also, we take it as a challenge to learn about that, and hopefully our New York Annual Conference can give us a kind of education for the laity and the pastor together, so that if really that happens, then the churches and laity doesn't have any confusion, so that we can move forward with those adopted policies to move forward to get all the benefit from that. Yeah. I think, and also once again, standardize the policy they apply to our annual conference. It's really important too.
Thank you so much. Andrea, can you tell us more about what worked well and what didn't in the Florida Annual Conference, and what challenges did you face?
Sure. So having Dr. Allen on board at the level in which she was doing this work was really, really helpful for us. She was a district superintendent at the time, still is, and now serving in addition to that role as director of the Center for Clergy Excellence. And so it was really good for us that she was a part of this work of expanding parental leave at that embryonic stage. And so she brought that to the cabinet, which was really good. And another thing that worked well is that the conference offers financial support to churches that would be in need of that, because we do have some churches who won't be able to provide full financial coverage. And so there is an amount of up to $5,000 that is offered by the conference to help to offset the costs of compensating for this time off that the clergy person was going to take. Another good thing is that true to the work of expanding parental leave, Florida has kept foster parents on the roll, and parents who are in the process of adopting as well. So the circle has been drawn wider, which is really a beautiful thing. And understanding that this works as a justice issue, understanding it as a discipleship, would be really helpful. It is part of what the Florida Conference did in terms of bringing this before the cabinet and then saying that this is what we're going to do because this is what the Lord requires of us. And so if I were to offer advice to conferences who are trying to do this work, I would say to shift the mindset, to see this work as a justice issue, to see this work as discipleship, do research, know what you have already on the books, if anything, see what is happening in your state and work with that as well, see what is already offered outside of local churches, examine the finances that the conference has and see where you can tap into some of that. Someone mentioned earlier that part of the funding came through clergy support. And so that is a place to look as well. Know who you have in your conference to help with the work, and somebody know who you have who can push the work forward and bring it to the right platforms, build allyship throughout so that you're not doing this work in a siloed situation. And I'm thinking that that would be very helpful for any annual conference that might be struggling with that. I'm not sure specifically what might some of the struggles have been in Florida, except that there might have been some rough conversations around financing it. And of course, when the time comes to implement it in certain congregations, there might be some pushback, but then this is legislature that the conference has, which is really good in helping local congregations to do this work as well.
Thank you so much. And Andrea, could you share where did the funds come from? So we can follow up on that question.
So some of the funds are coming from local churches, and the conference has offered to supplement that.
Okay. All right. And I just looked up the policy, the Florida policy that we have. The funds are all approved by the cabinet, and they fall under
Yes.
the Florida Conference calls Preachers Relief Board /CDF/district reserves. So that is where the cabinet in Florida found their funding. As a follow-up on the funding conversation, no one, the annual conference is not asked to provide the funding for the full leave. The annual conference is being asked to provide the coverage for leave, so that local churches continue to pay the pastor's compensation just like normal. But
Yeah.
the coverage that is needed is going to go up there.
Yes, the conference helps with that in collaboration with local district superintendents. And for the financial piece, if the local churches are not able to continue to pay the pastor's compensation and then to have someone come in as well, they provide up to $5,000 to help with that per person taking leave.
Yeah. And I believe they changed it to say, should a church need financial assistance? So in
Yes.
Florida, it's not automatically granted.
Correct.
But it is automatically granted in some other places.
Right, because there's an application for that.
Great. So, all right, we'll move on to Katie then. What challenges and did you face? What worked well? What didn't?
Well, I feel like after Florida, you got all the good stuff that you need to know. Like, Andrea, that was fantastic. What worked well is doing as much as the work for them as possible. So, saying, here is the document done, just vote. Here, we already figured out where the funding is coming from. Just, so making it very simple where anyone else doesn't have to do the work really helped move it along. What became a little bit of a struggle for us is in our conference, our bishop is very strong about the idea that he doesn't like to be tied down. So it's not churches have to. It's a not shall, but may culture is what he's trying to do. And that's where you go, okay, is this the hill we're going to die on? Right. And so we were able to, with the help of some very wise other people on cabinet, to kind of tweak the language so that way our bishop didn't feel like this was a binding thing, because of course we heard all of the worst case scenarios, right? What if 30 people take paternity leave, take family leave in 1 year? To which our answer is, great, we have a lot more kids coming into the Methodist Church, right? Like, you know, so just trying to help alleviate some of that doomsday stuff with the data that we had going, okay, it's not going to be that, right? And still be able to push through going, you know what, our biggest problem right now is just clarity of process, right? So to say, like, we were really pushing, you know, the good part about this is that now the DS knows what to do, and the person knows what to do, and the church knows what to do. And, you know, we kind of play into our bishop's like strengths, like, look, it's a nice, clear policy procedure. Don't you love that? Right. And so there's a little bit of give and take that has to happen, but we felt like we still got the goal, which is a clear and consistent, because there has been no consistency in our conference regards to this. We had the answers on where is that extra funding and support going to come from. And, you know, we did a little trick. I don't want to say it's a trick. It's a technique that I was taught once by an older pastor when I was interning. He had a really tough vote coming up. And so he said, okay, all those in favor? And yes. Yeah. Okay, moving on. And at the end of the meeting, I said, you never took a no vote. He's like, oh, you noticed that? They didn't. Right. So like we purposely set our legislation within the larger clergy support. Here's all this stuff. All right, just yes, no vote. Ready? Go. Because we knew that the people who needed to have the buy-in at the cabinet level were already there. And so we didn't open it up for, we gave the material ahead of time. And so we did that very quick, like, okay, does anyone have any questions? Okay, let's vote. And just go. And so that's how Missouri works. Doesn't mean this is going to work in other conferences, but the way we roll, it got the job done. And that I think is the most important piece in all of that. So Diane may be regretting that she invited me onto this, because I'm the one saying, here's how you sneak around your bishop, which is not the goal here, but you work within the system you have and you get to the end goal. There's my advice. And then do everything Andrea told you, because that's a lot better.
All right. So let's move on to Crystal and Nick. What worked well? What didn't? What challenges did you face?
So I think Mary shared a lot of the challenges that we faced, and what I shared earlier. I think one of the things that stuck with me that Katie said, Reverend Nix said, was about worst case scenario. And you might have to help me here a little, Nick, but I think that's not the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is when you have pastors who leave ministry because they don't get the support they need from the conference. And I think one thing we need to do going forward in Indiana is tell some of those stories and share how important this legislation is. You're going to have to help me for young families and for our church as a whole. Is that good?
Yeah. Yeah, you did good.
Thank you so much. And that is certainly a challenge. I think back to what Pastor Claire shared earlier in Upper New York, telling the stories of where things are broken and where things aren't working is so important. And to tell the stories of there is another possibility and another way forward. And so yes, we want to change those stories across the denomination, not just in 4 or 5 annual conferences, but across, especially across the United States, because it is in the US where our parental leave policies are particularly bad compared to the global standard. So I want to move to Pastor Claire and ask follow up on where the funding came from, so we can get that in. All right.
Sorry about that. Okay, funding. My understanding, the New York Annual Conference please correct me if I'm wrong, but churches will maintain their regular compensation for clergy on leave for the duration of the leave. But the cabinet will assist because if a church, the pastor is a vacancy, but the cabinet will assist the local churches and co-op parish as it relates to the provision of administration and coverage and the pulpit supply for the duration of the leave. So that's my understanding from the New York Annual Conference. Please correct me if my understanding is wrong.
All right. I see Denise waving yes, that is correct. Katie has also shared in the chat that they did have a member of the cabinet who says, well, why not wait for the general conference to pass this legislation? Like, why does our annual conference need to do this? And it's a yes, and that is the long-term goal, is that the 2028 general conference will adopt expanded legislation on the general level. If not at the general conference, then at a regional conference. And just as a side note, I hope everybody votes for regionalization when it comes up in 2025. And we can also make a difference now in our conferences. The more annual conferences that adopt the supplemental legislation now, the greater the groundswell of support will be for general conference changes. Okay. We have another question in the chat from that asked, when a loss occurs of any kind, would that be included in some way? Yes, in the model legislation, perinatal loss is included. And if you are in a foster or kinship care situation, when the child moves to another home, that is also covered through this. So we want people who are grieving to be able to have exactly the care and support that they need throughout that time. Okay. So some of you answered the question about what advice do you have for other annual conferences, but I want to give everyone a chance to finish that as well. Pastor Claire, would you like to start with any advice that you have?
Well, make bishop and the cabinet be with your ally. That's the first step. So it's much easier. So seek for their support. And if your annual conference has a cost role, have a conversation with a chairperson and seek for their support as well. And share our stories with many, not only to the men, but also to not only to the woman, but also to men. So we also, if you have a support from the male clergies, it'll be really, really helpful. So collect many stories and share with them, and it will move you very fast.
Thank you so much. Pastor Andrea, any advice?
Well, I guess I jumped the gun. I will say though, don't give up, because this is God's work. And if we're doing this work and we back down from it because of opposition or pushback or anything of the sort, then there are many people who are coming behind of us who will continue to fall through the cracks, who will continue to suffer. When my son died, I didn't know that this existed. And it was because I just absolutely decided I didn't need anybody's permission to grieve. I didn't need anybody's permission to deal with myself. And so I took time off. And I later learned that this is actually a thing, but at the time, nobody told me. And I also was told that if you had not done this, many people would continue to suffer in silence. So don't give up. This work is needed. People are depending on this. There are many voices that will never be heard. And we have the opportunity to project these voices, what I called raising God's voice. So when we do this work, we're actually raising God's voice, and we're doing God's work.
Thank you. Thank you. Pastor Katie, any advice?
Listen to all these really smart people on this thing because they are wise and they have good ideas.
All right, Pastor Crystal, Pastor Nick, any advice?
I just want to say thank you for all of you coming in and sharing your stories. We took down a lot of notes for our conference because we're not letting it end here. Like, we're going to keep on pressing forward till we can get this through.
Okay, so we now have time, a few minutes for questions. So if you would like to raise your hand, we can call on you, or you can put it into the chat. Please know if you raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask the question that you will be on the recording. So if you would like an anonymity, put that in the chat. And if you don't mind being on the recording, raise your hand. All right. I see Pastor Crystal.
That's so nice. I'm actually not a pastor. I'm one of our lay members.
Oh, I'm so excited to have lay people on this call. That's amazing. I love it.
But I am on our cause row, and I have done all of our legislative work, and I'll be working with Gabby, who's also on this call, to try and pass this at our annual conference this year. I think I have a couple of questions, and I think they might all run together, and you might answer them in the next one. And if that's the case, just tell me like, hey, we're going to answer that in the budget sort of one. But so several of you talked about like, how many, I'm wondering where you got the statistics to budget, if that makes sense. Like, what was sort of the average of, like, you mentioned, someone mentioned like the worst case scenario was like, what if 30 people took leave versus like a few people? Like, how did you average that out? I think our annual conference is going to look completely different this year. We have a new bishop who hopefully will be significantly better, and more caring, fingers crossed. And we won't have such uphill battles like we have in the past for anything and everything. But I do know, even with some of our leadership change, like our annual conference, and maybe it's because of our leadership, maybe not, has always been very finance focused. And so we want to make sure that we have the ability to sort of answer to all of that. So how did you sort of figure out how to, like, when you're talking about it, like those talking points, like average out, like, here's what we're thinking it might cost over time. Does that make sense?
Let's go to Katie. Her hand is up.
Yeah, that was one of the big questions we had to deal with right away. So there were two different things that we had prepared. And along with when we submitted the document of, this is the policy, this is the procedure for each church, each pastor, each DS, we also kind of had a frequently asked questions section as well to address a lot of these things that we knew would come up first. So we had two different data points. One, we asked someone who's had this in place for a year or two, right? So we went back to West Ohio, who has done this, and said, hey, how much does it cost you in the first year of doing this? And they said 0. I said, okay, that's a great place to start, because they didn't have anybody. And then the second thing we did is we emailed our conference office and said, anybody know how many people had taken family leave in the last year? And here's a surprise, no one had the statistics. So it was another point to say, perhaps we can do this better. And so then the old-fashioned way, via text messages and social media, we figured out in the past 5 years, we could identify, we thought, 4 to 6 people who have taken family leave. And so again, we could say these are the trends for our own conference. This is the trends for a conference that has had it in place. And because ours is coming out of a kind of an emergency pastoral support fund, it was okay to say, we are going to grant each church up to, and we put that dollar amount because that would make everyone feel better, going, okay, there's a limit. It's not an endless fund. Yep, up to $10,000 per leave to cover all the things that are needed. And it says in our policy, this begins with a conversation with the DS and the bishop, because, and then we state the goal. The goal is to support the pastor, the church, and the conference, right? Because of course the fear was, what if our smaller churches cannot cover this. And so we just had to say, no, no, no. It's the same as if the person was on leave or not. Like the local church does not absorb any of this. And as long as you kept repeating that phrase, everyone was breathing a lot easier. So that's how we did it in Missouri.
All right, thank you so much. And we did have one question that I think Denise was going to ask. Do you want to do that question, Denise? And then we'll probably need to wrap up for the day.
Yeah. So the question was around laity, and I think we addressed it in some of the annual conference panelists addressed that. So you might want, maybe if you didn't address it, you might want to address it. My understanding is that if you work for the annual conference, the lay person is taken care of. But if you work in a local church, are your annual conferences providing parental leave for those persons as well?
Yeah, so what the conference, what the legislation is able to do is to cover clergy, as well as we're able to cover, you can choose whether assigned lay supplies, depending on the terminology used in your conference, or certified lay ministers or deaconesses are also covered. And then the legislation explicitly encourages every local congregation to examine their own policies to match it. So that is one of the ways looking at laity work. I also put into the chat some frequently asked questions on funding with specific examples from the East Ohio Annual Conference. So you can look through that. As we move on today, we have an entire Google Drive full of resources that you can have. And so you can join the email listserv for more updates. And anyone on that email listserv has access to this Google Drive. I put that link into the chat. You can also just search on Google Groups, UMC Parental Leave, and request to join that. But the address is groups.google.com/G/UMC Parental Leave. Or just email me at rev.diane.kenaston@gmail.com and I'll get you set up. We are really excited about all of the wisdom that has been gathered over the past year in so many different annual conferences. And we will continue to work together over the coming months so that everyone is able to submit legislation by your conference deadline, which could be as early as January, it could be as late as May. So be sure to check that out. And in November, we will have a workshop specifically focused on finding funding in your annual conference, as well as any other questions that you may have in bringing this legislation. And that will be on Wednesday, November 13th. Details again in the chat. So
Diane, I'm willing to work with you on any annual conferences that have not been showing up to your conversations, or we feel that we don't have a contact with, and see if we can get a contact in that space as well.
Wonderful. So we're just so excited for all of you for the work that you're doing in your own context. This is long work, but the more we can do locally and in each annual conference, the more the groundswell of support we can make for general changes throughout the general church.
So I think it's time to say our thank yous. And I want to, of course, thank Reverend Diane for bringing this group together, and for the panelists, more than your time. I think you took a lot of courage to come on and share with us and give us some real tools that we can take back to our annual conferences or share with other annual conferences, especially as we find ourselves in different configurations. Let your neighbors know what's going on and what kind of traction you're making. So I think that you are brave and bold, and I just want to encourage you to keep on doing what you're doing, and let's listen and hear from one another. Diane reminded you about regionalization, ratification of regionalization coming up, but every time we gather, I have to put before you the importance of ratifying paragraph 4, article 4. G. Cosgrove's ratification task force is working hard, and so soon you will see more publication. I saw it just a week ago on our Instagram page of what it is, why we need it, and how we're going to get it ratified this time and not repeat what happened in 2016. So we're educating everyone. We're taking questions. We'll have more discussion so that everyone is clear about what paragraph 4, article 4 means. It means that women are actually able to be a member in the United Methodist Church, and that no one can keep you from membership or leadership as a lay leader or an ordained person or anything else that you might want to be. It also makes space for people who have different abilities so that they have access to everything that everyone else has access to. So keep this in mind as we move through these seasons. And I invite you, I'll write you, when I send you this email of the video of this time together, and remind you that next month, November the 7th, the conversation is around when we are the first. And I think that this is important to both lay and clergy persons. It's kind of reminded me of what Reverend Andrea said. She didn't know, like when we don't know what we don't know, and no one is willing to shepherd us into that space so that we are prepared to deal with whatever rises up before us. So please join us then as well. And we wouldn't be able to do all of this if we didn't have Crystal and Roya, our communications people from GCOSRO, on here directing our every move and making sure that everything runs smoothly. So we're certainly grateful for them as well. Oh, let me tell you one more thing, got 1 minute. In Norway, one of our new board members is from Norway, a pastor there. And I was telling her about this upcoming coffee chat, and she says, and her husband was sitting there, oh, we get a year off. As long as you, so I looked it up, as long as you've been employed for 6 to 10 months in a position, you get a year off. And if you don't take it, they kind of come after you, right? But if another option is, if you don't want to take the year off for your new arrival of a new young person in your life, you can get the cash and you can pay for somebody to take care of your child. So we have work to do. The US always thinks we're so ahead of everything. Well, I think we should check ourselves and get on board. Amen. Well, siblings, go in peace and go in God's grace and make it a day full of joy and hope so that everything that you do glorifies our God. Amen. Look forward to seeing you soon. Bye now. Thanks again, Diane.